Australia and China mark 50 years of diplomatic relations, which have been rather frosty of late. The Australian Foreign Minister has travelled to Beijing, a step towards rapprochement. So what are the sticking points and just how important is their relationship? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. Now, China and Australia are marking half a century of diplomatic ties, but there hasn't been a lot to celebrate recently. A rift that began in 2019 only deepened over the next 3 years. Australia's new government set about improving relations early on, with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese meeting President Xi Jinping at last month's G20 summit in Bali. Chinese trade sanctions do remain in place, but Wang's visit is the first by an Australian minister in 3 years. It's the latest diplomatic offensive, indicating a thaw in relations is underway.
The mark of success is dialogue itself. We obviously have a lot of issues to work through, and dialogue is a prerequisite for working through them. What I would say is what I've said to Minister Wang, State Councillor Wang. We believe it's in the interest of both countries for the trade impediments to be removed.
Well, diplomatic ties between Australia and its major trading partner, China, have been strained in recent years. Beijing imposed sanctions on Australian exports in 2020 after Canberra called for an international inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. Those restrictions notably apply to several huge Australian industries, including wine, barley and coal. Beijing was also angered when the previous government, under former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, shut out telecommunications firm Huawei from Australia's 5G network. Up to 2020, China was the biggest buyer of Australian iron ore, gas and coal. And China has also applied to join a Trans-Pacific Trade Pact. Australia is already a member and has veto powers over membership applications. While human rights are another area of disagreement, Foreign Minister Penny Wong raised the case of 2 Australian citizens currently jailed in China, journalist Cheng Lei and author Yang Hengjun.
Of course, I discussed Ms Cheng Lei and Dr Yang. We raise that in every senior level engagement that we are able to, and I've raised that in each of the discussions I've had with the State Councillor. And we advocate for a range of things in those discussions. They include for those Australians to be reunited with their families as soon as possible. But we also advocate for the observance of our consular agreements and for those Australians who have consular access. Obviously, COVID has presented some problems, but it is the case that Australia does believe that those Australians should be given appropriate consular access, and we'll continue to advocate for that.
Well, for more on this now, I'm joined by our guests. In Brisbane, we have Tess Cain. She's the project leader for the Pacific Hub at Griffith University. In Beijing is Huiyao Wang. He's the founder and president of the Centre for China and Globalization. And in Taipei, we have Alicia Garcia Herrero. She's the chief economist for the Asia-Pacific at NATIXIS. That's a French investment bank. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Now, we've had this 90-minute meeting, a very carefully worded press conference. I noted that when she was about to have a meeting this morning, Penny Wong had said, the ice thaws, but slowly. Alicia, what do you make of the melt so far?
Well, I think this is basically good news that we're having this physical meeting after Bali, because it shows that, there is possibility for re-engagement. That doesn't really perhaps means as much as re-engagement. Rapprochement might be the word. But I think this is not only Australia. We're seeing basically the US, we're seeing European member states. Everybody's kind of coming and realizing that a new Cold War is in nobody's interest. And I think this is part of that story. It's one chapter in that story.
Sure. I'm curious about the timing of this, though, from particularly the Chinese side. China's economy is obviously hurting hugely at the moment. It's feeling increasingly isolated because of its zero COVID strategy. Was Beijing perhaps ready to do this, and the change of government in Australia was just a good opportunity to do that, Henry?
Well, I think this is probably the best time, and as we know that in the last 2 or 3 months, China has actually started a very active, high-level diplomacy. President Xi has actually went to the G20, met Australian leaders there, and also, of course, we had the APEC, we had a parade of foreign leaders coming. Now we see foreign minister coming now, which is great. I think China, Australia fundamentally have no conflict, no geopolitical or border issues, and it's really unusual. And also, I expected that the bilateral relation has gone so low. So I think this is great. It's high time that we revive the normal relation, and maybe let's elevate that to a better level. So I think it's really a right time. And Chinese economy is also starting to boom again, because now they have lifted the COVID control, and we expect a retaliatory growth of the Chinese economy in the next year. So I think this is probably the right time to engage, and particularly China, Australia has such a very active economic bilateral relations.
Sure. Henry, sorry, just to follow up there, I'm curious about how much you think this particular rapprochement from the Chinese side has been driven by domestic concerns.
Oh, no, this is not, I don't think there's any domestic concern related, because really, there's 3 months ago, Chinese top leaders are already starting to around the world already. Being in Central Asia, in G20 and all the Thailand, all the places. And also we see a parade of foreign leaders coming, and 4 or 5 leaders come in November and December. And we're expecting President Macron coming probably soon. Secretary Blinken is coming. So everyone is engaging China. So in that kind of context, I think if Australia is not doing more actively, it's probably falling up behind. So I think it's a good time. And domestically, China is also geared up to recover from the COVID lockdowns, and it's probably the best time. Sure. I think that
let me bring Tess in here to speak about the Australian timing of all of this, because I also noticed that Penny Wong is just fresh out of the South Pacific as well. She's been on a tour of nations there, and relations with China in that part of the world have also been fairly controversial. In some places, they've led to violent riots too. What do you make of the timing here, Tess?
I think it's quite interesting timing in the Australian context. And as you say, literally last week, Minister Wong was with a bipartisan delegation in 3 different Pacific countries. This time of year tends to be quite quiet in the Australian context in terms of media and commentary. So I think that is significant in terms of how the Albanese government wants this to be portrayed. So yes, it's significant. But even before she left, Senator Wong was quite careful to be hosing down any great expectations that everything was going to happen at once. She's made it very clear that she sees this as something of a process. And certainly, whilst I don't know that the issues in the Pacific were discussed when she met with her counterpart in Beijing, but certainly a lot of the work that's been done by Senator Wong and her colleagues in the region since the change of government has been about trying to reassure Pacific partners that Australia's interest in the region and Australia's interest in them is more than simply trying to either compete with or contain China in the region.
Well, a number of the things that Penny says that she did raise were issues around human rights. We heard a little bit of that earlier in the show. She also, I believe, raised the treatment of the Uyghur minority and obviously the ongoing detention of these 2 Australian citizens, Cheng Lei and Dr. Yang Hengjun. These are obviously all very sensitive issues for Beijing. But Alicia, Beijing must have known that this was all going to come up, right?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that this happens every time a Western leader visits China. I mean, I think Penny Wong has 2 pending cases which the Canadian had unresolved, and I think it's now high time for Australia to solve this problem. But it goes beyond, as you said. I mean, there's 2 major issues. One is the very, the Australia's request to investigate the origins of COVID, which led to, of course, the further worsening of the relation. And now the thing is, Penny Wong is going, as China is opening up 180 degrees, with potential consequence for the rest of the world, because this is a massive, change in direction with potential mutations, etc. So, there's a lot of things beyond the ones you said that could be discussed also regarding COVID. So surely it's not only going to be nice words that we know, but I think it is good that these things are discussed. And I think that's why I still think the visit is worth happening by all means and purposes.
Sure. I want to take a look at some of the not very nice words that have been said by particularly, well, both sides, but particularly one side. I recall at one point towards the end of 2020, relations had deteriorated so far that China was actually publicly issuing threats. One Chinese official said, and I quote, "If you make China the enemy, China will be the enemy." And China at one point listed 14 grievances. It was a leaked document, and they included government funding for so-called anti-Chinese research at Australian think tanks, deliberately stoking anti-China hysteria, criticizing China's behavior when it came to Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, as well as some of them that we've discussed already. Henry, what's happened to these grievances from Beijing's side? Have they just gone away?
Well, I think, Xi came, you remember the date, 21st is the exact date of 50 years ago, and Australia and China established diplomatic ties. And then when they established ties, there's only 100 million total trade. Now it's 200 billion over, and over 2,000 times has increased since past decade, half a century. So I think, now we have such a great relation in the past. We have over 100 twinning cities and provinces. We have, student exchanges, booming tourism. I mean, Australia is the largest trading part of China, largest export market. China is for Australia. So all those good things. Of course, China doesn't, we don't understand why suddenly the relationship gets sour, because, of course, tracing origin is one, probably the reason. But on the other hand, Australia is so far away, we don't have a border issue. And now Australia is in the Quad, in the AUKUS of nuclear submarines. What that for? So, there's a lot of misunderstanding. I think mistrust has been created in the last number of years. Probably, on both sides too. But again, I think it's a turning point. The Prime Minister met the President Xi, and now the Foreign Minister is willing to come to Beijing to talk on all those issues, which is great. I think we need a dialogue. We need communication. So I think it's in both countries' interest to continue this. Promote understanding and then have a better understanding of China.
Because you listed a number of things there that China's not very happy about. But we've mentioned a couple of them that really triggered the deterioration here, the very rapid deterioration of relations. And one of them was the ban on Huawei, and the other was this request for the independent investigation into the origins of COVID. Tess, let me ask you then, you're sitting in Brisbane, what's actually happened in regards to both of those?
Well, the Huawei thing has been, that's had implications in the region as well. So we saw Australia take over, essentially offer to fund a submarine fibre optic telecommunications cable to service both Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. And that was essentially a very direct intervention in order to prevent Huawei providing that critical infrastructure. And then more recently, we've seen the Australian government essentially underwrite Telstra to buy out Digicel, which is a mobile telephony company in the region, because there was a concern. We don't know what that was based on, that the parent company might sell that to a Chinese operator. So this issue of who is managing, supplying, and running telephones and digital infrastructure in the region is one that is still very, very touchy and very sensitive for the Australian security community.
So clearly trust has not been built up in that regard. I want to move on to talking trade. Henry, you mentioned the huge volume of bilateral trade. Let's take a look at some of the numbers. In 2021, bilateral trade between the two countries came to approximately $231 billion. China's imports from Australia reached $165 billion. That's up more than 40% from the year before, despite the frosty relations. Australian imports from China were worth $73 billion, including goods like household appliances and telecoms equipment. And Chinese nationals also constitute, as we've mentioned, the largest number of international students and inbound tourists. Now, it's always been really notable that in 2020, Australia was one of the few developed countries in the world that had a trade surplus with China, that it exported more to China than it imported. But then China slapped on those trade restrictions worth, something like $20 billion? In that time, Australia has found many other markets for its goods, especially for coal and barley. So, Alicia, let me ask you, how much does Australia actually need China now?
Well, I think what Australia figured, although this was not known before China indeed cut or banned some of, not all, but some of the imports from Australia. I think what Australia learned is that China bans what China doesn't really fully need, but it doesn't ban what China needs. And this is iron ore and the bulk, basically, of China's imports from Australia. So that the shock wasn't as big as expected. And on top of that, because the rest of the world is in this energy transition, and everybody's looking for gas, everybody's looking for critical minerals, and that's where Australia is standing out. And everybody's chasing Australia. The Europeans are trying to conclude a trade agreement, free trade agreement with Australia. I mean, so in other words, it wasn't as painful. And that, I think, is very important to realize, that Australia is going to Beijing indeed, but Australia isn't going to Beijing because its economy is plummeting because of China. Its economy is actually booming. Unemployment is record low. There's no problem with the Australian economy. So that's important to realize.
Alicia, you allude there to something that's very critical for China, and that's natural resources that China desperately needs. Henry, let me ask you this. We've talked a little bit about Australian iron ore in particular. Is China now trying to shore up Australian resources? Is that part of the motivation for trying to thaw out these frosty relations?
No, I don't think so, because China has one of the big importers that they can buy anywhere, and then I mean, the reason that they bought from Australia because they enjoy good relations with Australia before. But then, if Australia is really put China as a potential enemy and have nuclear submarines and alliance with the security with the US and Japan on China, so what do you think about Chinese people? How do they feel about those things? Certainly, this is two-way street. So I think that now it's good time that we're turning it around. But still, I think that we do have.
Henry, sorry to interrupt you, but I'm slightly confused by what you're saying there, because you're saying that China doesn't need Australian iron ore, and it's worried about this lack of trust when it comes to security, and yet China's continued importing Australian iron ore even through these very, very frosty times. So how does that work?
Well, China certainly, they can buy from Australia, they can buy from other countries. I mean, which means China is still very, very reasonable. They are not stopping all the imports, of course not, and they are still buying from Australia, which I think is fine. But we actually, like my think tanks, Center for China Globalization, we hosted former Australian Trade Minister Birmingham in 2019. He came to my office. I deliver a speech and welcomed China to join CPTPP at that time. So I think we have a lot of things to collaborate. And I think for this region, for the Asia-Pacific, there's a lot of things that countries can work in together between China, Australia, Japan, and ASEAN.
Let me bring Tess in here, because
we have already signed ASEAN, which is good also.
I'm curious about how this is working out from the Australian side when it comes to trade, because now, after this conversation, they've agreed to expand high-level dialogue, which will now also include, presumably, between trade ministers. Tess, how soon do you think we might see any of these trade restrictions being lifted, if at all? Are you optimistic?
Oh, that's not really something I'm in a position to comment on. That's a matter for, obviously, I'm sure that now that these dialogues have recommenced, I'm sure that the trade people will be capitalising on that and trying to get things moving as soon as possible. And I know that certainly there is a lot of expectation on the part of Australian business leaders that they want to see these these issues moved along and barriers removed as soon as possible as well.
They do indeed. Well, we also can't have a conversation about Australia and China without mentioning the US. And I see that on the eve of this visit, Prime Minister Albanese made a rather striking choice for his new US ambassador, the former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, who not only speaks fluent Mandarin, but also, I believe, did his Oxford doctorate on Xi Jinping's worldview. He's also been heading the Asia Society in New York for the last few years. Alicia, is this Australia making its priorities in Washington clear?
Well, I have to say, indeed, you're quite right that it's a strange choice, but I guess, Kevin Rudd is probably good enough to also be the ambassador of the US, no matter his knowledge on China. I mean, but the thing is, I don't know how Penny Wong is going to how is it going to be that he's really not somehow maybe unintendedly interfering, because the US has such an interest in China. So that's going to be very tricky. Whether that was on purpose and there was a reason for that, I really can't tell. Sure. But it is indeed difficult. I think even for Penny Wong, if I were her, I would find it difficult to run my China policy and then have the US.
Let me bring in Tess here, because I'm not sure that it's viewed as such a strange choice in Australia. There's been a lot of emphasis on how to deal with China. How's that going over in Australia, Tess?
I think there has been a similar kind of conversation as, would it have been better to have sent Rudd to Beijing, because he does have such a strong Chinese aspect to his expertise, but he's been resident in the US for quite some time and obviously has built up some really important networks there. And I think that given Australia's position in the region and given the importance of Australia's relationships with countries in the Pacific and also in Southeast Asia that do not necessarily see China as a threat in the same way as might be the case in Washington, it's possibly not a bad thing to have somebody in Washington who can put forward, Australia's position and maybe have a more nuanced conversation about how different aspects of the relationship with China needs to be managed, particularly with partners, like I say, in Southeast Asia and the Pacific that see China quite differently and also have quite different views about the impacts of geostrategic competition.
Henry, let me ask you how the US and the US's relationship with Australia is viewed in Beijing right now, because you alluded to the AUKUS Trilateral Security Pact that was signed. That was in September last year. Obviously, a lot's happened since then. Anthony Blinken, as you also mentioned, is due to visit China early next year. How does China view the security situation now, especially when it comes to trust?
Well, I think just comment on Kevin Rudd. I was with him at last month in Singapore at the same panel on China, and I think it's a great choice. He understands China, he understands US. He obviously knows how to defend Australia's interests. So I think it would be great to have somebody knows the world to really be a ambassador to the US and of course advising both government on China. So what I think actually, the Blinken is coming, and I'm sure there'll be more U.S. officials coming. Chinese officials may go to U.S. So I think Australia is far away from U.S., far away from China. There's no interest for Australia to come in as a security alliance of some kind. The best position would be in the middle to have the best of the two worlds, rather than really lean on one and then really against the other. Which it's really foolish, because China is the largest trading partner of Australia. Its livelihood of Australia depends on China also. So I think now they have finally realized that and are doing the right thing, and so we'll be pleased to see that to happen. I think I would like to see Australia have a more strategic independence, and then maybe have a better relation with both U.S. and China, not just one and against the other.
Clearly, this is all very, very much part of a process, but I'm afraid we'll have to leave our discussion there for now. Thank you to all of our guests, Tess Newton-Cain, Henry Huiyao Wang and Alicia Garcia Herrero, and thank you too for watching. You can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Remember, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.